Hey everybody, welcome to this week's themes video for the Faerie Queene. As I mentioned in the previous videos, we're going to be looking at four central characters in Canto 1 to better understand their allegorical significance. So let's start with two of our main characters that we meet in the first 5 stanzas of Book 1. The Red Cross Knight, who is usually referred to by readers as Red Cross, and Una. So we'll start with Red Cross. Usually the Red Cross Knight is seen as embodying a Christian. Not all of Christianity, but the typical archetypal Christian. And the Red Cross Knight really is our main character in this work, so it's all kind of told from his perspective in particular. And there are a few ways that the appearance of the Red Cross Knight is inflected with allegorical significance. So in the first stanza, for example, he's described as having old dints of deep wounds in his armor, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Okay, so the fact that a knight is being cast as a Christian means that Spenser sees a Christian as a kind of warrior. A Christian is someone who needs to fight for things. And because the Red Cross Knight is wearing dented armor with, wounds on the armor and marks of many a bloody field, this Christian has been in battles before. This is not this Christian's, I suppose, first rodeo, as it were. He has been around the block. Moving on to another one of Red Cross's companions, we meet Una in stanzas 4 and 5. And Una is normally seen to represent the one true church. And you can kind of hear it in her name, Una, which means one. And this is key because Spenser sees Protestantism not as this new thing. It's not a split from the Catholic Church that starts something totally new. He thinks the Catholics are the one who have messed things up. They're the split. They're the people who left the true way. And Protestants were just bringing things back to where they were supposed to be and where they have always been from a proper biblical perspective. So Una, meaning the one true church, represents that kind of long lineage. And we'll see that in some of the ways she's characterized in these two stanzas. So first of all, in stanza 4, she's described as hiding under a veil that wimpled was full low, and over all a black stole she did throw, as one that inly mourned, so was she sad. Okay, so Una's wearing black, she's mourning, and she's very sad. Why is the one true church very sad? Well, we can impute that reason back to the Protestant Reformation. She's sad that there is like this discord within the church. She's sad that there has been a split at all. Let's go to the second quotation. And by descent from royal lineage came of ancient kings and queens that had of yore their scepters stretched from east, pardon the typo, east to western shore, and all the world in their subjection held. So we also know that Una comes from this long line of kings and queens that had of yore, or in the past, ruled over east to western shore. They ruled over everything and all the world held in their subjection, implying that this is also no more. Again, the implication is that there was a point in time when the one true church governed over everything, but now there's been this split. And so Una and her long lineage no longer rule over the world because of the way the church has been split. So these are our two main characters in the Book of Holiness in particular. The Christian, the Red Cross Knight, traveling with the one true church, Una. Okay, who do these allegorical characters meet along the way? Well, there are two main, I suppose we could call them villains, that the Red Cross and Una meet in this story. And the first is error. And you probably have figured out already what error allegorizes. Error, in fact. But there are some different nuances to that meaning as well. In what way does error mean error? Well, one of those errors seems to point to the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church is an error, or it's based in error. We can see that in a few of these quotations. In stanza 20, this is describing error. Therewith she spewed out of her filthy maw, her mouth, a flood of poison, horrible and black. Again, a little typo there. Her vomit full of books and papers was. Okay, so this monster error is spewing out kind of vomiting out a flood of poison, horrible and black, and her vomit full of books and papers was. So we have a monster who is vomiting books and paper and blackness. This seems to point to a couple things. The first is kind of what Spenser might call Catholic propaganda, this poison of books and papers that say the Protestants are the one who are wrong, and we Catholics are the ones who are right. Spenser would see that as a bunch of, vomit filled with books and papers. And the blackness of this also points to the role of the printing press in this dispute. Remember, the printing press is still somewhat new, only 100 years or less old in England. And so some of this propaganda is enabled by the sheer amount of volume that a printing press can generate compared to the kind of slow transmission that manuscripts push forward. So this vomit of books and papers also is kind of hearkening to the role of the printing press in all of this. Another part of this Catholic Church imagery with error is from stanza 25. They flocked all about her bleeding wound and sucked up their dying mother's blood. These are the offspring of error, making her death their life and ache her hurt their good. Okay, what's going on here? So after Error is killed by Red Cross, all of her thousands of offspring flock around her wound. They suck up her blood and make her death their life. What? That's like a really strange, vivid, and kind of scary image to be presented with. So what does this have to do with the Catholic Church? Well, as they suck up their dying mother's blood, you might be reminded of something we talked about in an earlier video about the Eucharist. You remember, this is my body, this is my blood, and they really turn into Jesus' body and blood. Well, from the Protestant perspective, they think that's just totally crazy. There's this aspect of almost cannibalism to that kind of ceremony when they're really eating Jesus' body and blood. And so here we see the offspring of error sucking up their own mother's blood in this kind of cannibalistic way that Spenser seems to be using to cast more condemnation onto the Eucharist itself as a kind of depraved, misinterpreted ceremony. In addition to these Catholic overtones, the fact that Error is a woman also seems to be really important to what Spenser has in mind for this monster. And so we're back on that theme of monstrous femininity that we've been spending quite a bit of time on in this class already. So for example, in stanza 14, Error is described as half like a serpent horribly displayed, but the other half did woman's shape retain, most loathsome, filthy, foul, and full of vile disdain. Okay, if Error is half serpent, half woman, then it's possible that Spenser is thinking of the story of the Garden of Eden in particular, in which we have a serpent who tempts Eve to eat the apple. And together these two are responsible for introducing error and sin into the world. So in some ways, that originary story from the Garden of Eden of Eve and the serpent have here been combined into a single character that represents error. So here womanhood is being deployed in that kind of allusion to the Garden of Eden story. And it continues by evoking a lot of images of womanhood, especially like a strange form of perverted or monstrous motherhood. 1,000 young ones, which she daily fed, sucking upon her poisonous dugs. Here the Catholic Church is portrayed as a kind of perverted mother, because if the act of breastfeeding one's children is normally seen as nurturing and kind and caring, this seems to be the very opposite, because Error is nurturing these children with her poisonous dugs rather than her kind of life-giving, nurturing dugs. Later on, she's described, I want to see this, I have to pause and wait for this bar to go away. I'll be very still. There we go. She poured forth out of her hellish sink her fruitful, cursed spawn of serpents small, deformed monsters, foul and black as ink. So first of all, we're returning to that idea that these are all like inky black monsters related to the printing press in particular. They're little serpents, again, recalling, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And They're all pouring forth out of her hellish sink, which if you look in your edition as you read this passage, you'll see that sink is a term that could mean Error's vagina. So there's a strange sense of almost like female panic that Spenser is drawing on here. Like this woman is so monstrous that he's using her own body parts to create fear, to create hatred for this figure. So I think there's a lot to think about in this story about Error, about what role monstrous femininity plays in Spenser's imagination and why he uses those images to represent the Catholic Church in particular. The second main villain in this canto is Archimago. And there seem to be two possible meanings of his name that lead to their allegorical significance. The first is that Mago comes from this word magus, which is also a word for magician in Latin. So we have this like magician figure in Archimago. And then of course there's also imago or image. So we could also see him as architect of images. And remember, if we go back to that Protestant Reformation video, images are bad for Protestants. Images lead to idolatry. They lead to false appearances rather than the real thing itself. So let's look at how Archimago is characterized. In stanza 29, he's described as an aged sire in long black weeds clad. That means he's wearing black weeds. His feet all bare, his beard all hoary gray, and by his belt his book he hanging had. Okay, so he's wearing all black, he's old, he has no shoes, he's got a gray beard, and he's got a book hanging from his belt. What image does that bring to mind, if that's what Archimago looks like? Well, it sounds a lot like what we and even Spenser would think of as like a monk. And monks, of course, are associated with the Catholic Church. So again, we kind of have this Catholic image of this evil villain. This happens again in the next two lines too. How should a lass, this is Archimago talking, silly old man that lives in hidden cell, biding his beads all day for his trespass, tidings of war and worldly trouble tell. So he lives in a hidden cell. He's got the beads, the prayer beads, more monkey imagery. He talks about saints and popes, and he sang an Ave Maria. All of this is very, very Catholic-y. And so he's being coded as Catholic, which to Spenser's readers would mean this is a bad person. This person is up to no good. And in fact, Archimago is very deceptive. Whereas Error just, went right out there and was like, I want to kill you. You're bad. Archimago is much more deceptive and keeping things secret to himself. After he meets Red Cross and Una, he goes into his cell and pulls out his magic books and seeks out mighty charms. So he's, doing that. And he conjures a false dream that, as stanza 47 says, made Red Cross dream of loves and lustful play. So he essentially sends Red Cross a dirty dream about Una, and he has a lustful dream about Una in particular. Okay, so I want us to think about why this is Spenser's second villain in the canto. Basically, a magician who looks like a monk who conjures dirty dreams for people. So these are the questions I'll ask you to think about in your discussion post. Going back to Error, why do you think Error is represented as both a woman and a mother? Why do you think Una, meanwhile, appears to be a virgin? Why are women being used to represent both churches here? How is gender and womanhood being used in Spenser's work? Or if you want to focus on Archimago, why do you think Archimago is represented as a monk? Why do you think he conjures up a dirty dream of all things? Like, how is that the most evil thing that you can imagine, a dirty dream? What do dreams have to do with the moral virtue of holiness? Is there some connection here that Spenser wants us to see? Or what do dreams have to do with images? Remember, archimago, images being a bad thing for Protestants. What do dreams have to do with images? These are questions that I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on in this week's discussion post.